And in around 30% of cases, the drug was allowed for payment by the healthcare system, but was restricted in some respect. So what are the types of restrictions? Well, typically they would be determined by clinical characteristics, patients with certain stages of cancer or certain degrees of severity would be determined for treatment. Another common restriction was to continue to use the drug only in patients who responded to therapy. And also they considered factors such as whether the patient had had previous use of that drug in an earlier stage of disease, or sometimes a drug was recommended second line after the use of another drug. I think what is really interesting, though, is to consider the reasons for restrictions. And these were quite difficult sometimes to determine, because by reading the reports, there were sometimes multiple reasons given. But this was our best attempt to determine the reason. And you can see on the left-hand side here, these would be the economic reasons, that there was evidence that the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio was too high, or that was given as an explicit reason for restriction. But I also want to emphasize, on the right-hand side here, one of the main reasons was insufficient evidence of effectiveness. And you may say, why is that the case? Because all of these drugs had a license from the European Medicines Agency. And a very important point is that often the evidence of effectiveness we need for the health technology assessment or economic evaluation goes beyond the evidence that we often get from the licensing process. And this is a problem that many companies, pharmaceutical companies, are wrestling with, because, of course, they have to produce the clinical evidence for the license for the European Medicines Agency, but then the health technology assessment authorities say, well, we need better evidence or more evidence than you provided for the EMA. Just to compare NICE with other agencies, you can see here this was an international study that compared the agency decisions in Canada with those in Australia and United Kingdom. And you can see that in all cases there was some level of restriction, although NICE's level of restriction was a little lower than the other countries. I think mainly because NICE is often quite keen to at least find some patient subgroups for which the drug would be cost effective and therefore recommended for use. So what are the major challenges? I want to mention three. There are many. The first one is the lack of head-to-head studies. What we would ideally want for our comparison between existing therapy and the new technology is a head-to-head clinical study where the two technologies are directly compared in a randomized controlled trial. But for lots of reasons, we don't often have that direct comparison. So one of the big challenges in economic evaluation is to make indirect comparisons, which can be done by various statistical approaches. And this is quite a big growth area in the field. And there are now some quite sophisticated approaches for making an indirect comparison between two technologies for which we do not have a direct head-to-head study. Another challenge is extrapolating beyond the duration of clinical trials. Economic evaluation needs evidence on long-term outcomes, such as survival, quality of life gain, and so on. But of course, clinical trials don't last forever, and so we have to make certain assumptions about what we think will happen in the future. And there's no unambiguously right way to make some of these projections. So in many jurisdictions, the health technology assessment and economic evaluation is not restricted to the period before the product enters the market. There's often some further collection of data to understand how the new technology performs in the longer term and in regular clinical practice. So an important message there is that this is not a one-time assessment. We often need to look at technologies after they've entered the healthcare system. Another issue concerns this measure called the Quality Adjusted Life Year. And we've had a lot of discussion of this in the United Kingdom because it's the chosen measure by our National Institute. And there are well-known methodological problems with this measure. But one of the things that is currently being discussed is whether the quality measure captures all the elements of social value. And this is a little bit hard to see, but this is some data from Australia, where the authors of this paper compared the technology assessments or economic evaluations on 26 different drugs, which they ranked in terms of cost effectiveness, from the most cost effective one at the top to the least cost effective at the bottom. So here we have $5,500 per year of life gained, and here we have $250,000 per year of life gain. And then they looked at the decision made by the committee. And you can see that there is a relationship between the recommendation of the committee and also the cost effectiveness measure, because there's more rejections down the bottom and more approvals at the top. But the authors of this paper also recognized that not every result followed the same pattern, that there were some technologies that didn't appear to be very cost effective but were still recommended, and some that appeared to be cost effective but were rejected. And they speculated why this would be. And I think this is quite interesting because it suggests that in a decision-making context, even though you're interested in efficiency, you would want to consider other factors. And one factor could be that there's no alternative treatment. If we don't approve this treatment, those patients have nothing to treat their condition. The seriousness of the condition could be another factor. The affordability from the patient perspective, if we did not approve the therapy for payment by the system. Overall financial implications for the government, which relate to the size of the patient population, as well as the cost of the individual technology, and a more general concern for equity or fairness in our healthcare system. So I can tell you, as an economist who does this work all the time, I recognize there's more to life than economics, and I think that's something we have to remember. So finally, what constitutes good practice? Well, we can compare these agencies that do health technology assessment in a number of ways. For example, what range of technologies do they evaluate? What types of evidence do they consider? What is the quality of the review process that they apply? What is the level of stakeholder involvement that they encourage? How transparent is the process? And how are the results of studies communicated? And there have been several principles of good practice. I'll just mention this one, which I participated in, where we really felt that some good principles needed to be established now that these technology assessments are so important, because they're being linked in many countries to the resource allocation decision. That is, the decision whether or not to pay for the particular technology. And I won't go through all of these in details because I'm sure I'm almost running out of time. But one question is the range of technologies. The important point here is that we shouldn't just focus on one type of technology, such as drugs, because the inefficiencies in the healthcare system affect the whole system, not just one type of technology. So it's important, as we do in the UK, to consider drugs, devices, procedures, and even public health interventions in terms of health technology assessment. What type of evidence do we consider? The most important point here is that although randomized controlled trials are the best form of evidence in many occasions, we need to think more about other types of clinical data that we can get when the technology is already in regular clinical use. And also, we perhaps shouldn't just focus on healthcare costs. We should also think about things like impacts on productivity and impacts on the patient and the family, as well as the healthcare system. The quality of the review process, I would only say it needs to be very high quality because the integrity of the system depends on that. The level of stakeholder involvement, this varies a lot from place to place. I can actually tell you, because of my involvement with NICE in the UK, their involvement of stakeholders is quite extensive. And every single committee has representations from patients and from industry and from management, from the key stakeholders in this process. And ways in which we can involve stakeholders are in how we plan the studies, commenting on draft reports, and in some jurisdictions there's even the scope to make an appeal against the recommendations. And we have that in the UK, and around 1/3 of the recommendations of NICE receive some kind of appeal, sometimes a very important one, but sometimes just a minor appeal. Transparency is important because we need to understand how these processes are conducted, and transparency is important because sometimes we make mistakes. And there have been two very important examples in the United Kingdom where the analysts made a mistake, but without transparency in the process, nobody would have known. So I think it is important that this is all out in the open and everybody can see what's going on. And then finally, in communication and implementation, I think it's important to distinguish between the assessment, that is the scientific bit, and the appraisal, which is where the decision makers' values enter into the discussion. And as I said earlier, I think it's important to consider the analysis within a broader context of aspects of social value. So in conclusion, economic evaluation is growing in use, usually within the context of health technology assessment and particularly in drug reimbursement decisions. However, this is not an easy road. It's not without its challenges. The whole process should consider factors other than just cost effectiveness. And I think we can learn from mistakes in other countries and begin to establish some elements of good practice where we can compare and contrast what happens in different countries. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Stipe, ili imam 30 sekundi?
Dodatnih.
Dodatnih 30 sekundi.
Samo za tebe.
Ja volim inovacije i Stipe voli inovacije, pa bi ja samo htio malo provesti jedno demokratsko istraživanje. Obzirom da se radi o međunarodnom kongresu, a meni je malo lakše na engleskom nego na hrvatskom, vjerovali ili ne. Zapravo kad sam se natjecao za ravnatelja HZO, pitali su me za potvrdu da znam engleski, ali nisu me pitali da li znam hrvatski. Tko je za hrvatski jezik? Ajde, dignite ruke. Engleski jezik? Half, morat ću in mid-sentence pretvoriti ono malo engleski, a little Croatian, ok? Izluditi prevoditeljicu. Ok. Ja volim jako kad se uspoređuju zdravstveni sustavi, zapravo 2000. godine kada je Svjetska zdravstvena organizacija napravila rangiranje zemalja međusobno prema određenim parametrima. To je dalo nekakve rezultate, ali isto tako pobudio dosta duhova i mnogo svađe na nacionalnoj razini. Čak su neke zemlje prijetili i zapravo izvršili prijetnju da uskraćuju novce Svjetskoj zdravstvenoj organizaciji zato jer su njihove zemlje bile po njihovom poimanju prenisko rangirane u tome.